Hey people, Solaris here. Sadly, the long-winded lore channels have gained a victory, but being the spiteful and proud warrior of purple representing the 3rd Legion, I have concocted the perfect solution. Well, not perfect. Welcome to this christening episode of the -S variety. You might be curious as to what that means. The A and B classifications are technically supposed to be one episode, but due to whatever reason, I split them up. The S classification stands for, well, speculation, which is upsetting. Why? Because if it wasn't obvious, through most of my Inquires videos, I am not a fan of speculation, because the wider Warhammer community is very capable of brushing away an easy answer because they think their headcanon is, well, canon. Now, before you get your circuits all fired up, I am not that upset with the idea of people having a bit of fun and making up their own stories. You can tell I've had a lot more negative experiences than positive in regard to fanon, but still, I engage in it sometimes because the rule of cool is a very dangerous narcotic. The problem itself comes from not understanding the source material. A lot of the stuff people conjure up out of thin air usually is within the lore. Granted, it's probably buried deep in a codex or novel, but still, you should exhaust all options before moving forward. Or better yet, ask someone to help you out. Wink wink, nudge nudge. This is one of the many reasons I made Warhammer Inquires. As you would have seen me display that I have an AO3 account in my plasma gun video, where I advertised social media. I no longer have access to those socials because my mental state is that of a bouncy ball, so I deleted them. Except the AO3, that one's still up. As such, I am in the bogs of fanfiction, which I do enjoy creating and reading. I think it's wonderful, but, again, people just like to make stuff up because the perception of Warhammer is very malleable. Which you might be saying, well, that's a good thing. It allows people to fully make their ideas come to light and let them have fun. Which is true, but you quickly stumble and create a bad habit. In moderation, this thought process is fine, but how can you call yourself a fan if you haven't even read the original work? What are you a fan of, perchance? Answer me that. That topic is for another video because it talks about something very complicated, layered fandom, but right now you want to know about one thing. The warp, the immaterium, the shady alleyway where you can juice up with juice. The place of all sorts of terrible things, demons, spelled D-A-E-M-O-N instead of D-E-M-O-N. The 4 gods of varying degrees of poison, dimensional rifts, time travel, corrupting power, and instant combustion. If you think it can happen, then it'll occur in the warp. Here is the crux of the issue, and why I laid you in with a different intro. The warp is not a tangible thing within the Warhammer universe, and at the same time, it is a paradoxical part of the setting. Already, out of the gate, you can feel the brimming anger in my voice because I have a lot of thoughts, and most of them are negative, because there are 2 interpretations of the warp, or immaterium, you can generally have. You can also call it the Great Ocean. Given this video is more speculation, I'd like to hear your own interpretation. Perhaps you agree with me, or you disagree. Elaborate in the comments below. Now, on to the first interpretation. Anything goes, otherwise known as a writing tool or narrative device. This interpretation, from the name, is more an out-of-sitting tool used to gin up a scenario and cause chaos. That flowed well. As such, it has the anything goes mentality of the writer. Unfortunately, this means it's often brought in when a boring scene has progressed far too long, and instead of swapping perspectives or just moving on, demons, or cultists, or some flavor of chaos corruption. From the surface level, you might say, well, that's fine and dandy, Solaris, it's just another tool and you can't get too upset over it because clearly it works. This is both true and also a catch-22. If you're unfamiliar with what a catch-22 is, it comes from a novel, and to briefly summarize it, quote from Wikipedia, link down below. One connotation of the term is that the creators of the catch-22 situation have created the arbitrary rules in order to justify and conceal their own abuses of power. End quote. Now, for the book itself, which is a satirical war novel written by Joseph Heller, in terms of that novel, it works because the satire and, well, catch-22 work in tandem alongside each other. You could see where this is going, and no, Warhammer isn't satire. The warp is an arbitrary rule, which the writers of GW abuse, to which they conceal it with the anything goes mentality. Again, on the surface level, this seems fine as it offers flexibility, and in the case of writing yourself into a corner, can free you if you are looking for an easy way out. And there we have a problem, or rather one of them. You'll hear me say that a lot. It's an easy way out. Now, in writing, you will inevitably slam your head into a wall and come up to an awkward fitting scene. This scene, whatever it may cause, you to scratch your head because no matter how you write it out, it just doesn't feel right. Either it's too long, too much occurs, etc. I'd wager this happens to most people who are creative, even not involved in writing and focus on other artistic ventures. Something just doesn't flow right and it's bugging you. Now, for our anything goes interpretation, it offers a solution. But like any quick fix, it crumbles and leaves a rotted hole in the story itself when used far too often. That's the key thing here. When used in moderation, it can be semi-excused because sometimes a scene has no good end to it, and a deadline is fast approaching. I understand why it is used, but the other problem is that it's used to do a lot of things that make it absolutely insufferable. And here we bring up time travel. I remember from Assassinorum Kingmaker, I think it was. It could have been another book. I've read roughly 90 or so Warhammer books. It's hard to parse, okay? And even then, I think I've read more. Written by Robert Rath, a man who would primarily be known as the head writer of Extra History, and of course, The Infinite and the Divine. One of Kingmaker's scenes involves time travel, where a fleet or ark ships, I can't remember exact details, arrives to the world and state that its claim to the world was decided millennia ago. The residents, understandably confused, say bugger off, and the Imperium swoops in to handle the dispute. Everything collapses, and chaos appears. Assuming, again, my memory did not confuse this with another book, we also have proper use of time travel as it always should be used. A nice, amusing joke. As with this citation, Grizguts was on his way to cause trouble, and whilst traveling through the warp, he accidentally time traveled and ended up right back at the start. But a copy of his Wa was also there. Wasting absolutely no time, he hunts down his doppelganger, reasoning to himself that he'll get a copy of his favorite gun in case of emergencies. But unfortunately, he killed himself in the past. Thus, he cannot exist in the future, and the Wa was stopped right then and there. This entire short blurb works. Why? Because it's more humorous and funnier, rather than serious. It also works because the orcs themselves have more leeway with this type of behavior. I don't like that they do, but that's been established throughout most of their faction, so we will work with it. It has worse reverberations for other factions because it is not as acceptable, which brings in the problem of time travel, because it is a Pandora's box. Once you've opened it, you can't close it. This is where the first interpretation ends, because what more can I say other than anything goes? It's a cheap trick and one GW is more than happy to devalue a story with. The whole ultimate evil plotline falls apart when you keep bringing things back into equilibrium and revert to the status quo. One step forward, one step back. The cycle remains endless, much like a promise needing to be remembered. Now, you might be wondering, or rather saying, okay, Solaris, you don't like this anything goes attitude because it's an excuse that's relied upon often. What about the other one you mentioned? This is my personal interpretation. And remember, interpretation is subjective or opinionated. But before we get to that, instead of asking you to comment a word, I'll ask you a lore question. You'll get an answer next inquiries, but let's see if you can match up with some lore knowledge. A little trivia, one might say. Here is your question. Who was responsible for the total eradication of the Thunder Warriors on Terra? I'll tell you this, it's a trick question. Good luck. Back to interpretation. This interpretation is what I refer to as mechanical or hardline. From the name, it is more set in stone rules which, if broken, cause havoc. My rules for it are simple. No time travel. Psykers, or a psychically weak area, are fair game for any sort of terrible incursion. Mass ritual sacrifice and a word I cannot say are also fair game. Daemons have to follow the rules of the material realm, and if they don't want to, then that planet better be stuck halfway in warp juice. It's just that easy and simple. I condensed all of what I said for the first interpretation and made it much more digestible. But to poke a hole in my interpretation, it's restrictive on purpose, and that will irk some people. Hence why I call this a mechanical interpretation, because much like a machine, it does one specific task and does no other. But the crux of why I use this interpretation is that, and here's some basic writing advice from me to you, creating a scene, be it book, video game, or movie, requires certain attributes and props. Now you might think, again to repeat myself, that no bars to hold you back or chains to keep you from putting pen to paper, or for most people keyboard to notepad, I like Microsoft Word personally. This is a catch. Not a catch-22, thankfully, but putting limits on yourself is actually better because it creates a problem that needs to be solved, instead of just an easy path. The easy path is laden with traps, and creating problems for yourself to solve is part of the fun writing a story and its scenes. That's the fun part about creativity. No one solution is technically the correct one, but when there is an absence of problems, or rather rules, then that devalues a story. Why? Because then any number of stakes you place into the story lose most of their teeth when it comes to the warp. You know exactly what will happen almost immediately. Now, again, you could like this, that's fine. But the way I view Warhammer is setting first, narrative second, because I had exposure to the miniature side first rather than the narrative, because the narrative is a lot easier and cheaper, in most instances, to get into. And living in South Africa, yeah, models are a pipe dream for a future Solaris. Support the channel. Subscribe. But there is an issue in this viewpoint, because if you take my stance, then a lot of Warhammer 40k's flaws begin blinding you because, side tangent, a lot, and I mean a lot of Warhammer books are not good. They are dry, boring, and wholly dependent on the author. You can get easily burnt out by reading a lot of Warhammer novels. The short stories are generally well done, though that's more the format of a short story, being generally 40 pages at most in anthologies and then 100 or so for proper short reads. That is where Warhammer shines, because, as the series catchphrase, Warhammer Inquires, not actual 40k, goes, it's just that simple. Because Warhammer 40k is inherently simple and straightforward. In the grim, dark future, there is only war. You can see the issue developing. I feel like a repeating record. You can add complexity to something simple and generally get away with it. Why? Because it does add depth. But here comes a trap, because there is what I refer to as complexity creep or narrative creep. The warp is one of those narrative creeping forces. At first, completely fine and had its uses. What was a warp used for? The 4 Chaos Gods reside in it. It is used for warp travel and the well from which powers are drawn for Psykers. 3 things. Bog simple. But it has since ballooned, and whilst it is unfair to throw blame at the community in most instances, here is where I throw blame to the community. If something is difficult to justify for your custom character, chances are reasonably high that feeling is right and you should go back to the drawing board. Listen, I understand I come off as a stick in the mud with Warhammer Inquires, but I do want to help you. I'm standoffish because I have a lot of experience with people trying to pull smart moves and making stuff up. Believe you me, I have to sift through many AI-assisted character sheets on a semi-frequent basis, and it grates on one's patience. A man doesn't read the Horus Heresy all the way to book 38 and then trek back to reread it for citations unless he really loves the setting he engages with. Believe you me, again, this isn't going to be the worst of the worst, because we haven't even talked about power armor yet. Goodness gracious, I could feel the blood vessels clogging and popping for future me. Though, you might be wondering, if we are going to talk about Psykers, we are. I hate Psykers. Why? Because their power scaling is like a bouncy ball. And brother, the speed at which it is thrown is at Mach 10. I cannot say with any definitive citation that I could muster what a Psyker can and cannot do. This also applies to blanks in some aspect as well, but thankfully they have been reeled in somewhat. But Psykers are infuriating. There is psychic schools of ability. That being pyrokine, telokine, cryokine, probably acidkine. A psyker can theoretically do anything. Which brings us right back to square one with the anything goes interpretation. Because one author might give his psykers drawbacks and cause their heads to explode, the other decides that psychic power alone can bring down a Thunderhawk or Stormbird. Another decides that blanks are useless and act exactly like psykers, but with a negative, or a Eisenhorn. And the other claims that psykers will pop like a grape if they so much as sneeze wrong. It is frustrating. Why? Because I had a big Rolodex of citations ready to go, fresh from the grill, and some arguments made. But as I wrote it out and started hiccuping along the way in my script, I noticed a lot, and I mean a lot of points of contention. And my personal rule is 5 to 10 points of contention means that it's better to speculate, because at that point, if the writers can't make up their mind, you should just experiment because it'll be less of a headache. If you are curious, the Psyker script started off as 2,000 words, then ballooned to 5,000, and then went all the way up to 20,000, roughly, to which I crunched that down to 7,568 words. I believe it is understandable that, from the sake of my sanity and voice, I am not going to waste my breath on a topic that is so confusing and frankly disturbing at how wishy-washy it is with setting rules for itself. But I made a promise. Well, a silent one, to help you understand Warhammer, and I will still try. Here is a simplified understanding to help you. Psykers are a lightning rod and battery. Lightning rod in that they gain a massive charge, similar to a lightning strike, and then store said energy for later use, much like a battery. And much like a battery, they have a selected amount of charge they are capable of holding before failure or catastrophic failure. From this held charge, they can perform a variety of actions. The most familiar you'd be would more than likely be Darktide and its Psyker class, which, despite my hatred for Darktide, is an excellent visual reference for the power some Psykers can wield. But you might be asking, well, how do Psykers learn? The easy way or hard way? Either they get lucky and figure out how to shoot lightning, move objects, read minds, divination, the whole kit and caboodle. Now, I personally believe that certain Psykers, mainly dependent on environmental factors, can have an affinity for a certain psychic school of thought. Telepathy, the act of reading minds, is simple and nearly every Psyker can do it. The simplest trick in the book, and even then, you don't need to read minds as Psykers, can see a legitimate aura radiate off of someone. Most of the time it is emotional and an after effect of one's soul. Guess that meme with the dude glowing can be a tangible thing in Warhammer. Wait a minute. Though, then we get into combat schools and can of worms, so I'll leave it up to you to decide whether one path needs to be taught or learned. The hard way with the potential of possession, explosion, or demonic incursion. But if you are knowledgeable or float around the lexicanum, you'll know that there is some form of scaling system for Psykers, known as the assignment, stunlock incoming. I'm going to tell you to outright avoid this. Why? Because it makes an already tumultuous topic even worse to discuss. It is needless complication, and here is where I bring up the lexicanum page. I do own a lexicanum account, not sure if I mentioned that in inquiries, but I mainly do so to make sure references, citations, and the like are up to date, and nothing fishy is going on with interpretation, because people have different ideas on how things work. A very shocking statement right there. Lexi page linked, as it is a citation, in and of itself in the description and comment section. Shout out to wider Warhammer Loretube for not citing any pages and basically plagiarizing info from the lexicanum for multiple years. Classy job, lads. Very classy. On that page, it does contain some usable info, but I still advise you not to put faith in the assignment. Why? Because the main source it relies upon is the Inquisition, a background book released in 2007. Another link to the Lexi in the description. Now, as I'm writing this script, future Solaris will get the book in question via a friend from Albania, and if there is anything useful, it'll be on screen now. If there was something cool, if not, oh well, which is a lie, because I got it earlier than expected. Now, whilst this is a good citation and well explained, we run into another snag. I sound like a broken clock at this point, don't I? Wall of text. Now you might say, Solaris, you complained we didn't have enough info, and now you're complaining that we do get info. Yes. Why? Information density. Warhammer is rife with useless details that the community convinces themselves is important. I'm not going to rip the floorboard from underneath you and say that all speculation is meaningless. Just be cautious and don't lose the forest for the trees. You don't want Spec Ops the line to your cognitive dissonance because you think the color of someone's eyes implies a different character trait. Minor stunlock aside, it really wasn't. This entire piece of text, which is stuck to a singular page, mind you, is dense. How dense? Information dense. I'm not sure if I said this in a previous inquiries or not, but I'll repeat myself. Warhammer 40k is an information-dense setting. Most of the information given to us is useless fact. Why? Because people have the mindset that narrative comes first before setting, when the opposite is true. Setting comes first, and narrative is an afterthought. Adopt this mindset for a bit and trace back events in the setting. It'll explain the quality of the writing and why there is so many minor or major retcons, because GW is trying to keep you engaged rather than move some grand story forward. Look no further than the return of Lion L. Johnson. Don't worry about who he is at the current moment, just stick with me here. The Lion was not a good person. The concept of an emotion was foreign to him, but in his defense, he grew up in a death forest for his first few formative years, so understandable. He fell asleep after going on a violent rampage, really tucking himself out, and then woke up 10,000 years later, having emotionally matured, or rather discovered that emotions exist. Why has he woken up? For plot progression? You must be new here. No, he was woken up by his brother, an angry red tomato with hooves and muscle wings. The two of them fight. Muscle Wings Tomato loses, and our newly emotional lion decides that, hey, perhaps this emotion things and trying to do a little good won't hurt. I have summarized an entire lore event in the space of 3 paragraphs. One if I smush them together. Wait, why am I saying this to you? Can't see my script. But from that summary, you can extrapolate what I mean. You can't? Okay, that's fair. It's a bit nonsensical. Basically, GW wanted to do a refresh for 2 armies, or rather 2 sub-factions, and they did so by giving them new models and refreshing a few older ones. Price rises, and Shillrack makes a video spouting off hot air. Bing bang bosh. Another financial landslide to the top for plastic narcotics. To repeat myself, I have summarized and now explained a pivotal narrative event or lore event in barely 3 minutes. Here's a fun game you can play. Look to GW's social medias and decide which faction is getting a book by who they are promoting often. I'll give you an easy one. We are getting new Emperor's Children models and gotten some pretty okay books, all things considered. I mean, we got something, which is better than nothing. Okay, stunlock over. Psykers! The assignment is a good system on paper, but the system only works as far as you reference it. And brother, I've not seen it mentioned after scrolling through at least 200 plus books for citations alone. I'm probably reading 87 or so. I have to go back and reread those books, but for the life of me, I remember maybe 2 instances. Even then it was mention of a system, but my memory is failing me. Still, if I can only remember 2 instances, assuming the best scenario, for a book released in 2007, 1 page dedicated to Psykers, to which this is an Inquisition-specific background book, it seems, at least to my understanding, that the system has either been willfully forgotten, or they came to the same conclusion that I did, that no one will understand a 24-point system, and it will come off as gibberish. Please don't use the assignment system. Just talk with people and reach common ground for what you both, or in a group, find acceptable for psychic feats. If all of this seems complicated and wholly not fun to partake in, welcome to the club. Your membership starts today. I can't even count the amount of times I've had to sift through a character sheet and had a heart attack the moment someone wants to be a psyker. Because it always is a 50-50 coin toss of them being a cool individual or a complete nutjob who will argue till the heat death of the sun. So, as per this series' catchphrase, let me simplify it. Psykers are a battery. They have a certain amount of charge which they can use, and going over this certain amount can lead to a failure and injury should they not be careful. If you really want to make it even simpler, adopt D&D's spell casting system. By that I mean, a psyker has a certain amount of costs for a spell or action, and once it's done, they must rest to regain said costs. The warp is a narrative device or writing device. It holds the 4 gods of chaos and the legions of demons for causing trouble and a ruckus. Do not, and I repeat myself, do not use the warp as an excuse. It is a terrible habit, and I advise you to be cautious when conducting writing business with it. This is, in my opinion, one of the worst Inquiries videos, but I tried to make it simple. Unfortunately for me, it is not that simple. We have lost today. GW will pay for this transgression.